Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're popping the hood on the United States Constitution. We're going to transform how you see it from, a static historical document sitting in a glass case somewhere into a highly dynamic living system of power and tension. It's an absolutely fascinating piece of engineering, and we're going to break the whole thing down together. And to truly understand how this machine operates, you've got to start right here with this incredibly famous premise from James Madison in Federalist 51. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. It is just the perfect hook for what we're talking about today. The founders didn't build this government for perfect people. They built it for flawed, ambitious humans. They knew for a fact that people in power would inevitably try to grab more power. So the entire system was designed around one brilliant idea: using ambition to counteract ambition.
All right, Section 1, the architecture of power, blueprints of a republic.
So, looking at the macro-level blueprints, a few things immediately jump out at you. First off, it's incredibly short. Originally, it was just about 4,000 words. Yet, it sits as the supreme law of the land, rigid and famously difficult to amend. Instead of a king, it sets up a true republic with an elected leader. But the real genius here? Separated powers. This entire system was purposely designed to limit government overreach, all while trying to unify 13 very diverse, very independent-minded states.
But think about it. To make those separated powers actually work, you need an ultimate referee. And that's where judicial supremacy comes in. This means the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, which is literally the ability to strike down laws that violate the Constitution. It's the exact mechanism that keeps both the federal branches and the individual state governments strictly within their own lanes. And honestly, it's exactly why Supreme Court appointments are treated as such a massive deal today. Moving right along, Section 2, A Tale of Two Chambers, the mechanics of Congress. Now that we've got the macro blueprints down, let's zoom in on the specific, day-to-day machinery of the legislative branch. The founders deliberately split legislative power into two completely distinct bodies. Neither chamber can just make a law on its own. They absolutely have to agree. And that forces compromise. Notice the stark contrast they set up here. On the left, you've got the House of Representatives, which is designed to be hot. With 435 members elected every 2 years, it reacts instantly to the passions of the voters. It's heavily rule-bound and totally driven by majority rule. But then on the right, the Senate is the cold, deliberative chamber, just 100 members serving 6-year staggered terms, acting as a continuous body. It leans hard on tradition, allows for nearly unlimited debate, and is fundamentally built to protect minority rights and intentionally slow the whole legislative process down.
Section 3, Who Gets to Serve? The Exclusive Qualifications.
So who actually gets the keys to operate this giant machine? Well, the constitutional bar is shockingly low. There are only 3 standing qualifications: age, citizenship, and inhabitancy. That is literally it. To be in the House, you just need to be 25. For the Senate, 30. Which means, in the eyes of the founders, you're officially wise enough to help run the country just a few years after you're allowed to rent a car. But this brings up a really fascinating question, and one that's been heavily debated over the years. If those are the absolute baseline rules, can individual states tweak them? Say, could a state add its own requirements for federal candidates, like forcing them to live in a specific district or imposing strict term limits on their own representatives? The answer is a massive, resounding no. The Supreme Court, in landmark cases like U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton, has firmly ruled that states absolutely cannot unilaterally add qualifications to federal office. The founders intended these requirements to be uniform across the whole nation. The qualifications written in the Constitution are exclusive, period. And here's the kicker. There is a huge democratic presumption at play here. The fundamental idea is that the people should choose whoever they please to govern them. If someone shows up in Washington with credentials from their state, they are legally presumed eligible. If someone wants to challenge a member-elect's right to serve, the challenger bears the entire burden of proof. Oh, and Congress can only exclude someone based on those 3 specific constitutional qualifications we talked about, not for their past conduct or their character. Section 4, the Elastic Engine. Implied powers. Okay, so let's look at how they actually exercise their power, especially when the Constitution obviously doesn't cover every single modern scenario. Enter the necessary and proper clause. This right here is the Constitution's built-in elastic engine. It grants Congress the power to use all methods that are appropriate and legitimate to carry out its listed duties. It basically lets the federal government stretch its authority beyond the strict explicit text so it can actually get things done.
But as you can imagine, this elasticity causes a ton of real-world friction. Back in 1819, this tension literally exploded in McCulloch, Maryland. It was a dramatic showdown. Congress had created a national bank, which, by the way, is not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. The state of Maryland was furious about this federal overreach and tried to tax the federal bank's Baltimore branch entirely out of existence. So the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice John Marshall basically dropped the hammer. He ruled that the federal government absolutely possessed the implied powers to create the bank, all thanks to that necessary and proper clause. But more importantly, he established absolute federal supremacy. States simply cannot tax or control instruments of the national government. The Constitution is supreme.
Which leads us to Section 5, the Commerce Clause evolution, the tug-of-war over commerce. You know, if the necessary and proper clause is the elastic engine, the Commerce Clause is the longest, hardest tug-of-war rope between the federal government and the states. The Supreme Court's interpretation has swung back and forth over the years like a giant pendulum. It started out broad, then it narrowed down to protect local businesses, and then in 1937, the court massively expanded federal power. They ruled that Congress could regulate pretty much anything having a substantial economic effect on interstate commerce. For nearly 60 years after that, the federal government's regulatory reach seemed basically limitless.
But then the pendulum swung back. In 1995, with United States v. Lopez, the Supreme Court finally slammed on the brakes. They struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act, ruling that simply carrying a handgun near a local school did not constitute interstate commerce. It was a massive, flashing signal that there were, in fact, still firm limits to federal power. So today we're left with this incredibly delicate balancing act. Congress can regulate actions that substantially affect national commerce. I mean, the court even used this to uphold federal regulation of local, homegrown marijuana in Gonzales v. Reach, but there are hard boundaries now. Like we saw with the Affordable Care Act, the government cannot use the Commerce Clause to force people to buy something. They can't regulate inactivity. And the states have limits too. Under the Dormant Commerce Clause, they can't pass laws just to block out-of-state competition. It's just a constant, unbelievably precise calibration of power.
Which brings us to our conclusion, the machine today.
The big takeaway here is that the U.S. Constitution is clearly not just a dusty piece of parchment from the 1700s. It's an actively functioning machine, constantly shifting, constantly balancing power. And as we watch this centuries-old tug-of-war play out in the news today, I really want to leave you with a question to ponder. Knowing that the founders purposefully designed the system using ambition to counteract ambition, does the machine still operate the way its architects intended, or has the sheer ambition of modern politics finally overwhelmed those delicate checks and balances? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning and keep asking the big questions.